Hey guys! In today's video, I'm going to share some of my most important tips for flourishing with brush pens. This deceptively complicated topic is one that leaves many people perplexed, even experienced lettering artists, so I'm excited to share what I've learned with you. By the way, if you want to see the rest of my 3-hour class, Flourishing Made Simple, that this footage is from, then check out the link in the description and you can access this class plus thousands more for free for 30 days with a trial membership to Skillshare. All right, so flourishing with brush pens. What makes brush pens unique is their flexible, tapered tip. So you can press down hard and make very thick lines, or you can use very little pressure and make thinner lines. We can use this variability in line thickness to our advantage when making flourishes, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, let's talk about these small, hard-tip Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens. If you're using a brush pen with a harder tip, like these Fudenosukes, especially one that has been worn down a bit, then you may be able to create hairline or thin flourishes. What does this mean? Well, the thickness of the flourishes are going to be consistent throughout. You won't have any parts of the flourishes that are any thicker than any other part of the flourish. Sounds kind of nice, right? I mean, it's simpler when you don't have to think about what part of the flourish should be thicker and which parts should be thinner. Plus, very little pressure is needed to make hairline flourishes. Here's a tip. If I'm making this style of flourishes, it can actually be easier not to have any guidelines for me to trace over. I can plan out the flourish in the air above the paper and then practice it 1 or 2 times before putting pen to paper. Using this technique, I can make my flourishes very quickly and without lifting my pen, which is pretty neat. In fact, I move my entire arm to make the flourish. However, if you're like me and you like to plan out exactly where you want every little detail, then making flourishes quickly and loosely like this may not be your cup of tea. In this example, I have all of the flourishes mapped out in pencil, and I move my hand a bit more slowly. Using this method, I find myself lifting my hand more often and making some wobbly strokes, since I'm making an effort to keep my flourishes close to the pencil markings. I sometimes may move my entire arm when making the flourishes, but I often only move my wrist. Oh, and notice how I wrote out all of the letters first and then came in with a hard tip Fudenosuke for the flourishes. That's my usual way of flourishing with brush pens, inking the letters first before I start on the flourishes. Okay, so let's shift gears and discuss flourishes where we vary the thickness of our strokes. Brush nibs are awesome because they allow us to make thick strokes, thin strokes, and to vary from thick to thin. This is how I make most of my flourishes. And guess what? You can practice making the same flourishes as me. Several of my flourished compositions are available as traceable downloads on my Patreon. For just $5 a month on my Patreon, you can access a new traceable composition every month, plus a workbook that walks you step by step how to make each letter, flourish, and embellishment. Becoming a patron also lets you unlock access to exclusive videos and tutorials that you won't find anywhere else. Okay, so back to flourishing. You can use any type of brush pen for this, even ones with harder tips. But let's first take a look at pens with more flexible tips. I'll demonstrate here with a Stabilo brush pen. In brush lettering, it is typical to make downstrokes thick, meaning when the pen is coming towards your body or down from the top of the paper towards the bottom of the paper. Conversely, upstrokes are thin. And here's what that looks like in practice. When I move the pen up, the line is thinner, and when I move the pen down, I make a thicker stroke. When we make flourishes, the rules are not so cut and dry. And that is why the technique for making flourishes with a brush pen is a little different than brush lettering. Let's take a closer look at what I mean. Here, I'm making 2 crossbars for the letter T. For this first crossbar, I'm holding the brush pen in the same way I would if I were brush lettering. In the second version, I hold the pen a little differently. And you can see that the part of the crossbar that is thickest differs from those of the first crossbar I made just now. For this crossbar of the letter T, I have made the stroke thickest where it is oriented horizontally. Notice how for this crossbar, however, the thickest parts are where the strokes are oriented vertically. Both of these crossbars are perfectly awesome to use in your lettering. There's no right or wrong. Here you can see me making a crossbar that is thick horizontally, and here the crossbar is thickest for the vertical strokes, and I like both. So what exactly am I doing to change where the stroke is thickest? I mentioned that I'm holding the pen differently. More specifically, I change both my grip on the pen and where the pen is in relation to my hand. When I want to make a thick horizontal stroke, as in the simple flourish on the descender loop of the letter Y you see me making here, I hold the pen such that my hand is closer to the bottom of the page compared to the pen. This makes the brush tip of the pen tilt towards the top of the page, and the end of the pen tilt towards the bottom of the page. When I apply a good amount of pressure to the pen, the line is thickest when the pen moves horizontally. And here's how that looks when I make a flourish off of an A sender loop. Notice how in this example, where I'm writing the word calligraphy, I grip my pen so that the tip of the pen tilts to the left while I'm writing the letters. Then, when I begin the flourish coming off of the descender loop of the G, I change my grip and the tip of the pen tilts towards the top of the paper, and the flourish is the thickest horizontally. Here's a tip. When you're inking in a flourish, rotate the paper so that you can easily make your flourish thickest in the areas you want, or so that the curvature of the flourish matches the way your hand naturally rotates. If you're making flourishes slowly and with precision, it can become really difficult to make the flourish without rotating the paper. For example, I was recording this piece to use as a video for social media, and therefore kept the paper in the same place for this very large flourish. But it took several extra strokes to make the flourish. Okay, so I'm going to speed this footage up a little bit because it took me a while to make. I ended up lifting my pen several times just for this one flourish. And I decided to just go ahead and rotate the page for this final flourish, and it was a lot easier. Another tip I would give is to lift the pen while you're inking in the flourish, if you feel you need to. Okay, I know this is kind of like cheating, but although it's super satisfying to watch someone create a complicated flourish all in one go without lifting their pen, it may not be practical for you to make flourishes this way. I personally spend a lot of time and energy designing compositions, so I cannot afford to ink in a flourish only to have it be half an inch off from where I had planned, so I feel like it's okay to lift my pen. In this composition, I made the flourishes quickly and loosely. You can probably guess that I made this design back in February. Because I wasn't too concerned with making the flourishes quote-unquote perfect, I felt free to use my entire arm in broad, sweeping movements. Notice how for most of the flourishes in this piece, I'm holding the pen in the same way I would if I were making the letters. So the flourishes are a little bit thicker when I'm making a downstroke and a little bit thinner when my hand is moving upward. So how do you decide which part of the flourish to make thick? Again, there are no rules, other than to stay consistent within one composition. Sometimes you may wish to keep the pen grip the same as when you are lettering, so that downstrokes are thickest and upstrokes are thinner. Your hand may already have some muscle memory to press down harder when it is moving towards you if you've been brush lettering for a while. Remember to avoid making your flourishes thicker than your letters. One way I will sometimes make flourishes with brush pens is to make almost all of the flourish thin, but then make the very last curve of the flourish a little bit thicker, regardless of which direction it is facing. Make sure you do this for all of the flourishes within one lettering layout, just like I'm doing here. And you only make the terminal end of the flourish thick. Some calligraphy artists recommend that you avoid crossing two thick lines over one another. Obviously, I don't always adhere to this guideline myself, but it is worthwhile to visit this topic and briefly touch on how to avoid crossing two thick lines. Remember how I showed you how to make a thick crossbar on the letter T earlier? Well, what if you want the crossbar to be thickest horizontally, but still be thin when it encounters the stem of the letter? You can make two separate C-shaped curves that begin thin, grow thicker, and then end thin. You just apply a little more pressure to the pen midway through and then lighten up the pressure just before you finish the stroke. Feel free to touch up the edges to ensure that the crossbar looks like one connected S-curve. So the same applies when you make a flourish off of an ascender or descender loop. You may find it helpful to pencil in where you want the flourish to be before adding ink. Here's a close-up view so you can see how I gently released pressure from the pen. Again, I am perfectly fine crossing two thick lines over one another in the case of a T crossbar or a descender loop or ascender loop. This guideline is definitely applicable though if you're making a more complicated flourish. Look how confusing it can become when so many curves of the flourish are thick. If you've made it this far in the video, I hope you found this content helpful. Don't forget to check out the rest of the Flourishing Made Simple class on Skillshare. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in another video.